I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alex. I'm one of the organizers of Global UXD, along with Mila, who you might have seen at some of our previous events. And to give you a little bit of information about who we are a nonprofit that's dedicated to design thinking, and really any type of creative endeavors. We were founded in 2014 in Berlin. And one of the things that we really like to do is bring together a sense of community. And so we bring on speakers, panelists, and have different workshops all around that kind of idea and ideology. There's a couple different things that we do, really starting off with events. And like I mentioned, we have talks, panels, workshops. One of our more popular events is what we call the Design Jam, where a bunch of different designers get into a room and they have a couple hours to really kind of hack on a project, so to speak. We also have series like upcoming wellness series that we'll be hosting, and different programs that we work with, not only the community, but also our corporate partners. We also have kind of a series of products that we are working on that really go hand in hand with some of the events that we're hosting. Now, due to the pandemic, a lot of those products have been kind of planned to be tied to virtual events. But now, as we're getting into the groove and getting back into kind of in-person events in the local chapters, we'll start seeing more of that as well. Overall, our goal is to inspire and create change through global design. And I'm really excited to kind of feature the upcoming speaker for today, who will be taking us through really what the next generation of a food facility, or in our case, a meat facility, will look like. And I was chatting with the speaker Kris for quite some time before this event, so I'm really excited to invite Kris to the stage. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Kris, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex, and everyone at Global UXD for hosting us today. My name is Kris Gasteratos. I'm the founder, president, and creative director at CAS, the Cellular Agriculture Society. And at CAS, we're interested in increasing global awareness of cellular agriculture. And that usually includes communicating with the public through design and creative endeavors like what we'll be sharing today. It's also such an honor for us to be talking directly with the design community. We're usually giving talks within the cellular agriculture space, and so to be talking directly within the design world is really an honor for us. So we're super excited about that. Without further ado, I'm going to transition here. All right. So today we're going to be talking about a previous design effort of ours at CAS in envisioning the future of meat production. It's something we call Project CMF. And today we're going to specifically elaborate on the artistry behind the endeavor. I think it's appropriate to give a bit of background on our work with Project CMF. So as a brief recap, Project CMF is the world's first accurately scaled, realistic depiction of a cell-based meat facility, or essentially our vision for a sort of slaughterhouse 2.0. The acronym for CMF comes from those last few words of a cell-based meat facility. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar, cell-based meat, which goes by so many other names these days, like lab-grown meat, cultivated meat, cultured meat, etc., is meat made by farming animal cells rather than animals. We originally unveiled Project CMF at Google in New York City back in July 2019. And its mission upon conception was really to provide a more authentic alternative to the conventional lab-grown meat imagery that we were seeing and still see proliferate, whether it's in press or anywhere across the internet. So there's a lot of nuance with CMF to dive into, but today we're going to be focusing on the process we undertook at CAS to design it. So let's move into the start of really any artistic endeavor, and that's the art direction, or more specifically how we planned out the visual hierarchy. The fine-tuning of this early on in the project was quite important for where we landed with CMF. I know we have some people outside the creative space in the audience today, so you may be wondering what visual hierarchy means exactly. Well, I find this to be a good example of this particular design philosophy in action. I'll give you a moment to read it. So while it's definitely not perfect, this text is generally quite successful in its presuppositions. And that's because of the concept of visual hierarchy. And so essentially what we mean by that is sort of determination of the priority by which we arrange design elements to show their order of importance within an overall composition. And so again, especially within the context of building Project CMF, visual hierarchy helped us to sort of think through what should take visual precedence within the design and what should really be emphasized within the compositions that we're creating. In this example though, if we were to standardize the size of all the text, we attract less particular attention within the visual field to the lines of text that were previously the focal points of attention. And of course, there are other factors that can de-emphasize importance here too, like the capitalization of each word that further draws your attention, and that's usually just due to linguistic traditions that we all come to find so familiar. But the more we standardize individual design elements, the less attention we're designating to each in particular within the composition. And so conversely, if we return things back, we see how the desired elements stick out once again. And so this is how we can influence the perception within a design, guiding the viewer's eyes towards a sort of hierarchy of importance that we're trying to create. So let's pull things back. How does this relate exactly to the future of a meat production facility? Well, through CMF, we had this opportunity to recreate the concept of a slaughterhouse. And in doing so, we really wanted to avoid any sort of anchoring bias that could exist. And there's all these different directions we could take it. So we had to really reflect on the influences that could carry over from our pre-existing understanding of meat and how meat is produced today. So we need to honestly acknowledge and reflect on all that meat and slaughterhouses represent currently. And that means the good and the abundance of happiness and tradition that meat offers to consumers around the world, as well as the bad in the industrialization and brutality that has become pretty commonplace within factory farms. And so there are a number of these light and dark motifs to acknowledge within animal agriculture. And so it's really critical to think about which of these should transition into this new system of cellular agriculture that we were being tasked with designing through Project CMF. So we considered how this and many other design characteristics would interplay with each other. And over time, a variety of qualitative measures began to unravel in our planning. We found design characteristics we felt we really needed to have present in our design. And so this critical bunch started to culminate into the sort of DNA for CMF, the building blocks, if you will. There are, of course, restraints, both economically and artistically, with trying to create a realistic vision for the future of meat. But we also didn't want to be naive with what could be possible. So in a situation like this, where there's just so much fertile ground, we really have a lot of freedom to take the design in virtually any direction. And it's really the novelty of making CMF and kind of creating what the future of meat production will look like. That really gives us a chance to think about what qualities the composition should take on to optimize its strength and ultimately sort of pave the way for this revolutionary concept that we represent at CAS. So the many words you see here are the descriptive terms for what we aimed for CMF to pull off visually. They exist as our visual vocabulary, and they tell us what sort of visual elements will be contained within the final design, at least the ones we planned for early on. In categorizing, selecting, prioritizing the set of vocabulary, we could prepare to envision what we really wanted to set out and create with Project CMF. And so each of these characteristics culminate to help us assess our design challenge. And that's thinking about how can we improve meat, the future of meat, and how does that start with where the future of meat is produced. And that's at the time early on in planning for Project CMF in this sort of facility that we're trying to imagine. And so again, please keep in mind that our main constraint for the project was accuracy. The design for CMF is set in the year 2040, so we had to build these design elements around objectivity And that's based on the research we had carried out on actual 20-year projections for the cell-based meat industry, and that was supplied by scientific partners of ours at CAS, our CAS industry partners. And they lent us their technical expertise to lay out what would be realistic, dimensions-wise, for a future facility like CMF. Anyway, so this brings us back to visual hierarchy. And we need to somehow balance this conglomerative set of vocabulary that we built into the actual design for CMF. And that's where prioritization, of course, comes into play. So let's highlight one of these characteristics as an example. Clearly, an important trait of a future-based design like CMF is the sense of futurism that exists within the composition. Since it's literally set in the future, and not just a few years away, but decades, in some fashion, the characteristic of futurism needs to really be on display for our scenes that are set 20 years from now. And there are a ton of branches that we can get into, but let's focus on just one design derivative of futurism, and that's robotics. So more specifically, advanced robotics like those from Boston Dynamics. So cutting edge, or at least cutting edge today, robotics like this are a feature we think is important for how they relay the futuristic motif, and which ultimately needs to be captured within a vision like we were creating for CMF. So while robotics like this relay the sense of futurism we're aiming for, we arrive at this question of, how do we integrate that into the overall visual hierarchy for CMF? So we're going to explore that for a moment. When thinking about the extent to which we include something like robotics in a design, we can think of it like a sliding scale or a gradient of intensity. And so the gradient ranges from something more subtle towards something more intrusive or aggressive. And it can be useful to think of this similarly to volume, or the degree to which we're enhancing a certain design characteristic along a gradient of, sort of presence-ness, sort of metaphorically, for this case, leaning on a sense of sound when we think about how these design elements are going to be present in the design. So design elements with a larger composition, or design elements within the overall composition, can be really loud. Sort of visually, they can be really loud, or they can be really quiet visually. And so something really loud would be very present in the design, while something really quiet is not so present. And so we have to reflect on how intense a message we want to communicate when it comes to particular compositional traits. In this case, we're looking at robotics and how that trait might be portrayed loudly or quietly. So we're going to look at a few examples, and these aren't perfectly representative, but they should help get this idea across in relation to sound. Perhaps Max is a bit hyperbolic, but in this image, the trait of robotics is quite intense. It takes up the majority of the scene and delivers a strong message as to where the viewer should look. Going down a notch, this scene features robotics to quite a bold or loud extent, but other concepts are being relayed too, like the packages which communicate logistics, as well as the warehouse in the back, which you can see, and that sort of just gives you the sort of scene that this is all contained in. Moving forward, we get to a composition that features robotics in an even quieter manner, and while they're one of only a few elements on display, the robots don't take up as much visual real estate as in the last couple images. So little else is being signified in this design besides the robotics and the color, which also acts as an additional enhancer of attention. And then finally, let's figuratively sort of mute the robotics characteristic. So here, clearly no robotics can be seen anymore. And so the level to which they are featured as a trait of the design is non-existent or mute, you would say. So now, keeping with this robotics motif, let's actually move over to our first look into what we do with CMF and dig into the artistry a little bit. So you can see the design element in action throughout our main interior render. And here are a few areas that feature the advanced robotics trait. within the design to varying degrees of subtlety throughout the facility here. So again, looking at the gradient of visual hierarchy, we aim for a pretty subtle integration of advanced robotics in the scene, and perhaps even quite subtle. And you may be wondering, why would we take such an approach to not feature robotic more prominently? It's the year 2040 after all, so, we sort of, if we're going to buy into sci-fi movies and everything else, we would assume there would be a lot of that. Well, the reason for keeping robotics like this more quiet sort of stems from, of course, balancing the accuracy, and we really can't predict with great accuracy the degrees that robotics would be included, though we do think they would to some extent. But we also had this original objective and for CMF, and that's that we wanted to ensure that, especially the main interior scene that you're seeing right now, we want to ensure that emotion and the sort of feeling of life is a top priority. And we didn't want to lose the emotional connection of that in pursuit of some sort of futuristically enhanced scene with a lot of robotics, even though that might be perhaps a more accurate view of what this sort of facility would look like in 20 years. So to illustrate what I mean here, let's see what CMF would look like if we were a bit more aggressive with this design element. So we've now drawn viewer attention in a different direction by making certain elements a bit more subtle in exchange for making the robotics element more bold. And so the trait of robotics plays a more prominent role within the design, but at what cost did this sort of change make? The foreground positioning of the robot alters our visual hierarchy. It's sort of, to harken back to you'll read this first and this second, we're kind of changing the size of these, even just slightly. I understand it's just one robot, there's others in the scene, but it's being placed in a direction where it's going to get more attention. And so just like the standardizing of the text, whatever our focus was previously, it's now having to share the space with this new element that's drawing viewer attention. Placing the robot here detracts from the main areas we want to focus viewer attention on, and that is, in this case, the large cell cultivator structures. Those are the sort of large tanks in the background, and then the subject characters. And more notably with the subject characters, the sort of human connection of a daughter learning from her father about this sort of process. So with a robot featured aggressively like this, these primary subjects, they're still prominent in the overall composition, which is what we want, but again, even so slightly, their priority in the visual hierarchy is decreased. Now let's push to the other extreme and see something that feels more human, perhaps. Let's say we not only remove this robot, but all robots in the scene, all of these advanced sort of Boston Dynamic robots, muting the feature throughout. So we've certainly achieved the goal of repositioning the focus on our two intended areas, but the fine details that can really help make a scene special, those tertiary and quaternary details that are finely placed throughout a design, are now missing. And while it might not be particularly noticeable, since the robotics in this scene already play quite a subtle role, in another scene, like this one, our media production floor, the trait of futurism is enacted to a greater extent. So removing the robotics here would make a larger impact. Not to mention in a scene like this, where we're aiming for an even less emotionally evocative move, we really want to highlight futurism over the human connection. So muting the robotics trait is even more antithetical to our goal within this context. There's certainly a sense of warmth and humanism that is sacrificed in this design over the last. The robots are more subtly featured, and there are more emotional themes at play in the main interior scene. In exchange, we indeed made a slightly more cold and clinical scene here, and ultimately we felt this worked for the media production floor. It's an area that's away from public view, and sort of feels fitting to have that more industrial approach. But for the main interior design, it just wouldn't suffice. So that's how we went about that. So that's robotics and some of the visual hierarchy within CMF. Let's move on and talk about artistic nuance. Starting with the inclusion of language within CMF. So we have this sort of sliding scale, again, that can help us determine to what degree we want to utilize a particular characteristic within our design. It's all a balance, really. And in this case, we were quite clear since the beginning of the project on our intention to avoid any use of language altogether. This is a general goal of ours at CAS, and that's really just to maximize the immersion of our creative works for the intended international audience we have. If we label something in English, for instance, there's an entire subset of people that we can potentially lose. Not to mention we also run the risk of losing immersion for the English speakers too, as our eyes naturally can get pulled away from text on screen. Or text sort of draws our eyes, I would say, so it's pulled away to the text on screen. Now, language can obviously be quite useful, but can also detract from compelling stories we want to tell visually. Here, for instance, you can see one of our less emotional scenes, but we felt even more scenes like this needed to avoid language. We generally try to lean on the motto, more show, less tell. And in CMF, we felt succeeding in that philosophy meant we'd be that much closer to really creating this sort of true international awareness on cellular agriculture. In contrast, our main interior scene is more visceral, so there are different tactics we need to employ visually to achieve proper communication, all without the usually very critical tool of language. Again, the main idea in this scene is that elements like language, which often provide maybe the strongest communication medium, cannot exist because the artistry itself has to communicate such a profound message. There's just not really room for it. And that means meticulous attention to detail is needed to craft design elements properly. That's usually needed regardless, but it has an even elevated importance when there's no language present. So we can move on. So when creating the scenes within CMF, we had decisions to make regarding color and lighting. We had sought out to create CMF with the year 2040 in mind, and the season would be the summer. So something well lit that could highlight everything within the design properly. And that was kind of the decision that we had to make. So that was our position on lighting. Next is the nature of the light itself. On one hand, we can go with artificial lighting, and on the other with sunlight, usually from windows or an all-encompassing light source, such as the sun in an exterior scene. So for CMF, we actually employed both artificial and natural lighting. We feature a uniquely staged interior scene, multiple interior scenes, and a singular exterior scene for now. And these are, of course, going to call for different lighting arrangements. So that's what sort of caused our decision making there. Proceeding to the topic of color, we have the option of bright versus pastel colors. Obviously, different elements may have limitations we have to work around, like the grass outside appearing its natural color, but we're specifically thinking about the key design elements throughout CMF, of which we felt pastels were more appropriate to deliver a non-threatening yet serious message. And that's, again, mainly for the building design, is how I would say it. The best example of this is the cell cultivators, where the more neutral, soft color we ended up with allowed for the size of the cultivators within the composition to convey their importance over a sort of highly saturated color. The farm animal to animal agriculture is what these cultivators represent to cellular agriculture. They represent something so much bigger than just themselves, as they're encompassing the innovation for which animal biology has laid the groundwork over countless generations. At least that's the kind of theory we're trying to get across in kind of producing these things with such intense thought and caution. Really, all the traits for these cultivators were really approached in a very meticulous way. The size, the form, we're going to get into that, but the color was very key. So while we wanted to draw ample attention to them, it would be too bold of a move, in our opinion, to color the cultivators with some unnecessarily strong chromatic traits or something. So we're quite content with where we landed here. Moving on, we had to decide if we wanted to create a more surrealist, artistic scene that was perhaps more abstract and metaphorical, or something that was more photorealistic. And as you've seen already, we proceeded with the latter. So we still wanted to give CMF a certain look, so we couldn't go too far into hyper-realistic design. Obviously that bars the sort of natural limitations of modern 3D software with artificial physics systems. And ultimately that's something for our next projects we're really looking to be pushing, which is that photorealistic boundary. And we're interested in seeing the extent that can go. Continuation on lighting, we gave quite a bit of thought as to how epic or standard the lighting should be. We thought about how strongly we'd implement features like God rays, which creates more epic cinematic environment over just standard lighting. This is indeed the direction we went in for our most important scenes, intense lighting with high dynamic range. I should note too that, especially for lighting like this, it's very easy to lean into epic so heavily, as it seems to correlate with conveying higher importance, but it's really quite integral to not go overboard with that. Even with an innovative project like this, obviously we created CMF to show an exciting future vision, and there needed to be gravitas with that. But we also want to be thoughtful and communicate something through the lighting that means, not giving it an impression that's ingenuine or feels too fantastical. So the lighting needs to really keep everything quite grounded in reality. So our last example here is about the extent to which our composition was focused on customary or inspiring scenes. Again, pretty important to not go too extreme here. The inspiration we wanted to get across was contextual to the importance of the scene as well. But for the most part, CMF does intentionally aim to be an inspirational visual set overall. Especially for certain scenes, we needed compositions that would create a real sense of wonder and sort of artistically deliver the breadth of cellular agriculture, almost like a visual translation of 90 Reasons. And that's just to convey the importance of the concept overall. So certainly we kind of felt, a picture can tell 1,000 words, and that's something we should utilize. A good example of the inspiration being integrated is in our main interior, or main exterior, I should say, where we emphasize elements like the birds to the right, and expansiveness in the landscape, and a beautiful sky. All of these placed at high priority to achieve the visual hierarchy that we were after. There's really so much more we could explore related to this topic of artistic nuance, but here are the topics that fall upon the artistic gradient of CMF that we'll hold for discussing another day. So you've now seen some of the thematic nuance within the artistry of CMF, but let's dive a bit deeper, exploring the key highlights throughout each scene. So we'll begin with the main interior, thinking about themes we wanted to integrate like transparency, primary versus secondary subjects in the scene, and soul cultivator form. Starting with transparency, you can see the windows here. The large glass windows let in a great deal of light, and of course they do that for the artificial physics system, but they're also signaling openness and transparency. And this was important to contrast for a traditional slaughterhouse, where the architecture is opaque. For CMF, or sort of next generation slaughterhouse, we needed to ensure transparency was maximized. And that's something that all of our industry partners felt was very appropriate and accurate as a prediction as well. The many visitors convey this too, of course. The only area where transparency is sort of purposely blocked off is within the R&D center, where we use frosted glass to protect the confidentiality that's taking place within. Next are the primary and secondary subjects, of which we've already discussed to an extent. But the cell cultivators, visitors, and conveyor belts with meat are definitely the areas we work to draw attention to. And the R&D centers, small cultivator tanks, employees, robotics, cityscape, these all played a smaller role within the scene. And lastly, we explored the color previously today, but the cell cultivators were thoughtfully crafted in aspiration of creating the massive, kind of iconic structures they represent. It was definitely a balance between making shapes that stand out uniquely and offer symbolism, but still remain as relatively simple geometry that people can recognize easily. And again, we wanted to stay quite abstract here, so avoiding language was key. We could have certainly been more direct and, let's say, labeled every tank with some descriptive term like meat production or something like that. But in exchange, we would have lost a level of immersion. So including language was certainly off the table. Next, let's look at the food processing floor, in particular the worker attire, primary and secondary subjects again, and the meat cultivator form. Starting with worker attire, it was a challenge to think about not only what clothing might be fitting for a scene 20 years from now, but how would such clothing tailored for workers at CMF, look within different settings of the facility. So we landed with something more neutral, and ultimately, since it's a sterile environment on this floor, where meat is being produced and everything is blocked off, the employees don't have to wear excessive equipment, and that creates a more pleasant scene as well when it comes to attire. Next, looking at the primary versus secondary subjects, you can see we developed this render with the conveyor belts more prominently framed towards the front here. And this was to illustrate a distinction between the production processes at CMF and the final packaged product. As we've previously discussed, robotics played a larger role in the visual hierarchy here, as it's a more industrial setting and there's not as much emotional outreach that we'd be sacrificing. So you can see some displays that show where the food is being safely monitored as well. And this is just overall a more economical scene. So while it's big because of the size of the facility, the ceilings are nowhere close to the main interiors, and it's just more about delivering this message that serious work is happening here. And lastly, the meat cultivator form. There are the walls in the back, and they sort of fade into the background. They're certainly less iconic in their form as the cell cultivator tanks, but features such as their green lights indicate a power on attribute to them and make them a bit more unique than merely just a wall. It was also an interesting challenge to show the point of visual exposure, where meat is leaving the tanks and being prepared for food processing. And all of that is taking place at the meat cultivators. And creating this transition took some refinement and likely will be revised quite a bit further as our designs evolve past this iteration of CMF. Moving forward, we have the media production floor, and with key highlights being its minimalism, architectural geometry, and the form of the cellular media. So this was a scene that we didn't want to overdo. It had a expansiveness that we wanted to convey, just overall for its importance, but we almost went for this sort of warehouse look. The message was relatively simple. This is not a super busy floor, and while there is indeed much activity, it's largely controlled with automation. Robots play a more key role in the scene. And other than that, there weren't really many other critical messages we want to get across. The detail of the media production process is a pretty complicated matter, and we're saving that for future designs and video work at CAS. And it's definitely intentional, by the way, to position the human models as we have. Their photorealism pales in comparison to inanimate materials, so placing them further in the scene and kind of backlit, not showing faces, is ideal. All viewers are very used to analyzing them since we see humans all the time, and understand sort of the aesthetic features at a really profound subconscious level. So the human models need to be really thoughtfully incorporated to pull the scene together properly. And it's a bit difficult to give this presentation because I know there's some people who are unfamiliar with like 3D modeling and whatnot, and a lot of people here, of course, are, but just want to give that the context there. Regarding geometry, we want to create these smooth, sort of non-threatening yet ambiguous structures that contain the powdered media, and water tanks mixing together to create the media you see as the main feature in the design. And that segues nicely to the cellular media itself and the form we went with. It was an interesting design challenge to tackle, but the color and viscosity of the media was influenced by realistic accounts from scientists we worked with, as well as our intention to create a media with a sort of pastel color that felt non-aggressive. If we made the media bright red, for instance, it might have made a more clear point that the cellular media is for cells, and it's sort of playing this analogous role as blood is within an animal's body. But in doing so, we felt we could jeopardize the visual strength of the cellular media as a design element, so we didn't want to do that. And lastly, the main exterior. So let's discuss the scenery settings, the form of CMF as a building overall, and another visual project of ours, CAS Vision. So just as a reminder, this scene is set for a summer in the Northeast United States in the year 2040. The sky, greenery, and vegetation are all set according to those metrics as well. And you can also see there's a top floor within the building that is closed off, but it allows additional sunlight to enter into the main interior. And the form of CMF had a variety of influences. A major breakthrough for us early on was thinking about the concept of a cell as architectural inspiration. So muscle and fat cells and anatomical designs and biology generally We're really huge in concept development. For instance, you might see, or you might remember, it's probably easier in the main interior. You might remember the R&D center that's placed in the center of the building. That's supposed to sort of reflect the nucleus of a cell or the DNA, where the instructions on how to make the proteins are housed. It's both, again, for cells as well as like the building design. And for protein production in cell biology, you have raw materials that come into the cell, and they get processed internally, and they're eventually exported outside the cell. And for us, it was the same kind of thing with the building, where raw materials are being brought in and proteins are being sort of exported out. So that's how CMF mimicked kind of protein production. And there are other noticeable cell references, like the shape of the building being circular, and even the year we chose, 2040, as a sort of nod to cell doubling. But the internal architecture positioning for protein production is probably just a more interesting signifying trait, so just wanted to highlight that. But there's certainly others. And lastly, you can see CMF within other artistic endeavors of ours, like CAS Vision, and down the distance here you can see CMF resides. It's the focus of the gaze for the two cows, both of them kind of moving their heads between particular environmental characteristics that signify our people, animals, world messaging. And if you want to learn more about CAS Vision, you can visit our webpage for it, cellag.org/vision. So to close today's discussion, I want to touch on the future of our efforts at CAS to design cellular agriculture-based meat production. More specifically, what exactly will be enabling the transcendence of CMF and advancing the project's evolution forward. So in this conclusion, we'll also be touching on how people around the world can develop their own 3D visual projects like CMF. We've received a lot of commentary on that. And that's, both either further the field of cellular agriculture or any other domain of interest that one might have. So all the computer-generated 3D visuals that you're seeing, they're all possible because of three primary advances. And these advances are really changing the world of 3D creation. They're making it so people without formal or technical 3D design experience can create results that would have been unimaginable for single individuals to achieve a short time ago. That means a project with a mere 3 or 4 figure budget today can accomplish the same, if not superior, results to a multi-million-dollar Hollywood film from just a decade ago. And there's evolution occurring everywhere, of course, but I'm specifically highlighting real-time creation tools that can produce photorealistic environments like you're seeing here. So at CAS, we really feel so confidently that visuals fuel world-changing missions, and they inspire the visionaries who make the impossible that's happening in these startups right now happen. So here are the advances happening in various industries that are enabling us and possibly you to visualize your creative dreams and bring them into reality. So the first and perhaps most important is hardware cost. A graphics card that would competently allow you to design complex environments in real time has dropped precipitously recently. Today's mid-range cards like NVIDIA's RTX 3080 or an AMD Radeon 6800 XT can fuel 3D designs like what you just saw, certainly surpass it, and visuals that would be impossible with similarly priced GPUs even just 5 years ago. You would have needed large teams and workstations costing many, many thousands of dollars and hardware that was just unattainable by the masses. And so there were just a number of key advancements in this industry, but to not get overly detailed, the main takeaway is that reasonably inexpensive graphics cards now have excellent functionality, and perhaps the most positive aspect of this is it should only be improving over time, and continuously bringing costs lower and performance higher. By the way, there's a global chip shortage underway, so that might be temporarily spiking prices, but this first topic of hardware costs and how that relates to 3D design advancement still stands as a main pillar for 3D potential in the digital space. Decreased hardware costs is only one part of the puzzle to create world-class visual effects and cinematic environments. You need the right digital tools at your disposal that the hardware can run. So luckily, while hardware costs has decreased, world-class tools utilizing things like ray tracing and other powerful 3D facilitating techniques, rendering otherwise, have not only decreased in cost, but the three examples you see here are completely free to use. Unreal Engine, Blender, and Quixel being the three. They're amongst the many free or extremely inexpensive 3D software these days. although there's sort of three leaders. And this set of software has truly created a powerful suite. So just that these are three we would recommend for anyone interested in getting involved in the space. Unreal Engine Blender and Quixel are amongst other free or extremely inexpensive 3D software, but this set of software has truly created a powerful suite that has not only revolutionized their respective industries, but a range of other industries that find utility in the creative capabilities they offer. And last is the learning material that provides education on how to use 3D software. Because the internet and its proliferation across the world, it's as simple as visiting a website to learn how to work with any of the software we just outlined. And the cost is, again, either extremely low through something like Udemy or Skillshare, or even free through something like a platform like YouTube. And so while we have the chance to, I want to give a big shout out to the people in these fields who've made these three major advances a reality. They've made 3D creation available to virtually anyone who's willing to put in a dedicated effort to learn how to create digital worlds. And we're just so grateful for the possibilities that are unlocked here, and they really only possible until recently. And again, super excitingly, it's only going to get better. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone tuning in and all who made Project CMF possible, including our team at CAS, as well as our community and donors who enable all of our work for cellular agriculture. You can learn more about CAS at our website, cellag.org, and we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to keep updated with our work. We send out newsletters a couple times a year, only really on our big project releases. And you can also find us on our social media at Cell Agriculture. And to learn more about Project CMF in particular and stay updated on our creative work there, designing the future of agriculture, you can visit the CMF website at cellag.org/CMF and follow the CMF specific social media account at Project CMF, just one word. Well, this has been such a fantastic opportunity speaking with everyone today. Once again, thanks for this opportunity, Alex, and everyone at Global UXD. It's been really awesome sharing the artistry behind Project CMF, and I look forward to any questions you may have. All right, I'll hand it back over to Alex.
Great, thank you so much. And I see some questions are already coming in. So if you do have a question, we don't have chat enabled, but we do have a Q&A section. And so feel free to start putting any questions you have in the Q&A, and I'll take a look at some of these first ones. And so we have a question from Tu who asked, how did you think about visual hierarchy from an architectural standpoint? And I believe we did actually cover this a little bit, but do you want to reiterate a little bit, Kris?
Yeah, sure. So as we shared, maybe I could share my screen again. Essentially, the emotional connection between the father and the daughter, and then also the large cell cultivators are the main areas that we're trying to draw attention to, as well as a sort of like leading line almost with the conveyor belt. So this is like the main area to draw attention to.
Cool. We have a comment from Robin who just says Tesla truck. And I think I saw that too. That was super cool.
Yeah, there was a bunch of technologies to try to incorporate like Tesla, like autonomous trucks, Tesla trucks, Boston Dynamics, what else? A sort of Hyperloop systems in the main exterior to on the side. So yeah, a lot of that to try to get more features in the scene.
So we have a question that comes in who asks about the project. Is this project based on plans for a futuristic real building, or are you visualizing what a slaughterhouse in the future would look like with CMF? So a company can use it for, I guess, they're saying propaganda.
Interesting, yeah.
But who is your audience, the company and the consumer?
Certainly a lot of questions here. So based somewhat on those. Yeah, so the goal in doing this is, as shared, that we really think cellular agriculture will have this sort of world-changing impact in the next few decades. And so a facility like this is something that's on the horizon and plays somewhat of a large role because it's the sort of like innovative production plant compared to, sort of in contrast to what's been used for so long in a slaughterhouse is the production method, factory farm, and then a slaughterhouse, of course. And so the goal is to visualize something that up until this point wasn't really visualized in the way that we're doing it. And I think that's to help people understand, like we shared in the beginning, this sort of contrarian idea to this lab grown. And I would say that's more propaganda than what's being shared with CMF. I mean, these are projection, it's difficult. I mean, we have dozens of industry partners, companies around the world who are working on this concept, and to sort of collate all of the data and then put it into something that will represent this visual that we think could be possible within 20 years is the main goal. And again, that's because in 3D modeling, everything is based within what you just saw on legitimate sort of numbers. So the size of the cultivators and how much volume is within them. And this is not a sort of like 2D drawing, it's sort of rendered within a 3D environment. So that's the first point. It's a whole other can of worms to get into propaganda, and if it's something like that. But who the audience is, it's just a global audience like we shared. So without using language, we want to make sure it applies to anyone who just sort of learns. I mean, the goal is that anyone around the world who's aware of what meat is and sort of grapple with the idea that this might come from cells in the future could just be shared this visual, whether that's from our website or somewhere else, and sort of be like, wow, that's what this could look like over what's done now with animal slaughter. And then, yeah, it's certainly, we are not a producer, a cellular agriculture sort of producer of product at CAS. So producing companies will do this, or the meat industry, as in the conventional, working with some of these startups or something along those lines. And then, yeah, for consumers, for sure. This is not trying to push anything. Certainly, we want to show it in a light that we think is accurate and sort of reflects a lot of like the ethos of the concept. So not killing animals, for example, sort of has this more like positive sort of energy to it per se, and so we sort of want to convey that with the imagery. But otherwise, many people have contention with like the concept, and we're not saying everyone should consume cell-based meat or cultivated meat. This is just sort of showing what something like this facility could look like. So a lot of questions there.
Cool. And I think, one thing that was really interesting for me is that, there was that area where the public could come and view. And I think nowadays, whether it's meat or soap or any other product that you use on a daily basis, you do want transparency. And so I thought that was really cool.
Thanks.
We have another comment from an attendee who says, beautiful imagery. Why choose New York City for the project?
So a few reasons. One, it was sort of a nod to the event where CMF was unveiled, which was in New York a couple of years ago. But we felt like having some sort of like reasonably iconic background would be useful. And also, we had sort of done this search on like a Google map of where something like this could fit. It's a 250,000 square foot facility. There's a lot of other metrics that we'll eventually release on our website and whatnot. But this kind of like mega plant was supposed to compare to like, I think it's in North Carolina, the world's largest slaughterhouse. We used to be really familiar with the figures as to how much production is there, but yeah, it was something to sort of mimic what was happening in North Carolina. I'm not sure. Really, the New York reasoning was primarily the event and something that we felt like could. I mean, the other big goal was like to produce this kind of mega plant, which most production facilities wouldn't be of this scale. This was certainly of massive scale. And how could we relay how tremendous the production quality was, sort of juxtaposing a geographical location? And so that we also picked New York because it has a very high consumption of meat, obviously in the entirety of New York City. And this facility, based again on like early projections and cell density figures within cultivators that companies helped with, throughout the years and whatnot, this plant would produce as much meat as the entirety of New York City would consume annually. So that was another really core reason. So it was like, one, the event was there, of course. If the event was in Chicago or something, might have been there, but it was really just to show we calculated what the entirety of New York City consumes in a year of meat, and how much a sort of facility like this with current science, projections of what the science could be, tending to be sort of conservative, could produce, and we found it could match the entirety of New York City. So that this facility supplies all of New York City too.
Cool. And before I forget, I do want to mention that the way you did the sliding scales of kind of like the different elements, I thought was very cool, nice for framing. And so with that, we'll actually go to Vanessa's question, who asks, were the environments rendered in one of the 3 recommended free softwares that you mentioned? And goes on to say, as someone who is starting in Blender, how necessary is it to branch out to other similar software?
Yeah, so I mean, starting with CMF, we were very early, and I'd say in our sort of induction into the creative space. We use SketchUp Pro and V-Ray, SketchUp Pro for the modeling and V-Ray for the rendering. And this was just to produce a still. Our next goal, and I think it's wonderful to start in Blender because I think it has such tremendous capacity. And whether it's Eevee or cycles, I mean, you can do some really insane stills as well as like live render, sort of like live shots moving. And I think that I think working a workflow between Blender, Unreal, and Quixel, which is kind of what we shared, is a productive one. I think some of the recent developments with Unreal Engine 5 and Lumen and Nanite, which an early release of Unreal Engine is out now, but I think the full release is coming next year, 2022. I think is a good sort of workflow, maybe Blender for like heavy modeling, and then Unreal Engine 5 for some of the live shots. At least that's what we plan to do. But I think Blender cycles within Blender could be beyond confident. So if there's anyone to start in and sort of like stay in exclusively, it could be Blender. I mean, there's just absurd results that are possible just exclusively there.
Great, awesome. We have a couple other comments coming in. One was the visuals were very nicely done. And then the other is the horizontal, from Michael, the horizontal conveyor belt and the vertical cell cultivators are familiar kind of factory and also farm shapes. From a futurism standpoint, did you consider other spatial forms that further evoke molecular cell production?
Interesting. Yeah, so there was a lot. We used to sort of have this like running doc of all these things that sort of nod to the concept of the cell. Another thing I can think of right now is in the main interior, you'll see a sort of glass divider, which isn't extremely, we didn't, at first we had this sort of rail, and then we decided to do this sort of glass divider, just to sort of like make sure people don't fall off or whatever, but not so that they don't contaminate products because they're already packaged. I mean, thinking about the food security or sort of food safety of the whole facility was really important. And so after the sort of products come out of the conveyor belt, the glass that's dividing people from it is actually shaped in the form of like a myocyte. This was sort of the goal of it, to sort of like shape it in the structure like that. What else? I think I mentioned the main one with the DNA sort of R&D in the center. There's a maybe another one will come to me and I'll think about it. I think that was the main other one that I was going to include, but I didn't. But.
Cool. And then there's just one other comment regarding HY, asks that, they don't necessarily know the process, but was there any reason why you didn't want to showcase any visual contrast from like the old slaughterhouse design to kind of this new version? And I guess, maybe to kickstart that answer is that, slaughterhouse kind of concept would actually be out of the picture here. Is that right? Any thoughts on
Yeah.
the
So for some video ideas, we certainly will, I think, go a little more macabre and show the true nature of what's going on in factory farms and slaughterhouses, at least largely. But I felt like there's a lot of justice that needs to be done to sort of do that well. And I think within a still, it would be really tough to do. And if we didn't want to, I mean, I understand this approach from a lot of companies, for example, where they really sort of go this more like corporate-y route that's like very positive and doesn't really show anything negative. I think we have a little more freedom at CAS to show the contrast, and it's a wonderful idea. But I do think that with how meticulously detailed it would have to be to get the right idea across and not kind of be too on the nose, I think it can come across to like activisty if it feels really aggressive. I think that needs to be really meticulously done with motion, and I think some of those other software, Blender, Unreal Engine, etc., will be very useful for doing that in the future. But CMF, we wanted to just keep the stills on the sort of positive image for this. Yeah.
Great. And we have a couple other comments that are just kind of related to the process. But I think as we're coming up on time, we'll close it off here unless anybody has any additional questions. Maybe Kris, you could just tell us one more time how to get in touch with either you or your organization.
Yeah, everything can be found on our website, cellag.org, and our social media is at Cell Agriculture. Our social media, everything can be found from there. That's the main source.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And for those of you who kind of stuck to the end, we will be posting a recording of this presentation as well. And so without further ado, I will say thank you very much, Kris, and we'll close it off.